It's our weekly mailbag show. You have plenty of questions about the wide receiver position and the way the Jets offense will work, and I will answer them on today's episode of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, March 30th, 2022, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com. Thank you for making this show your first listen or your first watch every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit that subscribe button, and you'll never miss an episode. And if you happen to be watching on YouTube and like this episode, please give it a big thumbs up. It helps the channel out, and it helps other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Today we have our weekly mailbag. Each Wednesday we try to do a mailbag show where I answer listener questions. I don't know whether it's because of what happened last week. I don't know whether it's because I've been ranting about wide receiver all off season, but we have lots of questions about the wide receiver position, so I'm going to get to them today. And we begin with a question from Tommy. Tommy asks, I don't know if I like the idea of the Jets drafting a wide receiver at 4 or 10. It seems like a bit high for this class. If you look back at last year's draft, you had 3 receivers in the top 10 in Jamar Chase, Jalen Waddle, and Devontae Smith. The year before, you had a good class of guys, including CeeDee Lamb and Jeremy Jeudy, and none of them went in the top 10. Can you rank this year's class among the last 2 to give me a feel of where the receiver prospects stand? Well, my sense is that among the people who really know the draft well, this is not as good of a class as the class in 2021, and certainly the class in 2020, which was viewed as kind of like one of those historically great classes. The class 2 years ago in 2020 was viewed along the lines of that tremendous 2014 class that had the likes of Odell Beckham Jr. and Mike Evans and a bunch of really guys who turned out to be really solid receivers, Brandon Cooks. That was kind of the quality of the 2020 class. Last year's class was also a very good class. This year's class, the perception is it's not that strong of a receiver group. But that's not necessarily an indication that there are 0 quality options. The 2013 class was famously viewed as a very thin group at the receiver position. In that class, you had Keenan Allen, who's had an excellent career with the Chargers, and you have Deandre Hopkins, who widely viewed as a top 3 receiver in this league and has been for a number of years. So just because on paper it's a pretty weak class, there still are going to be some exceptions in most years. Even when you have a weak class, you'll find a couple guys who turn out to be really good players. So when we talk about drafting a receiver at either 4 or 10, if I was starting from scratch, if I was just beginning in a neutral situation, do I think 4 or 10 would be the best value for a wide receiver this year? Probably not, but the Jets are not a neutral situation. The Jets are obviously a team building for the long run, but the most important aspect of building for the long run is the development of Zach Wilson entering his second NFL season. And there's only so much the Jets can do. A lot of this is going to have to come from Zach Wilson just improving off a rookie season that had some struggles. But there are things that are in the Jets' control. And one of the things that's in the Jets' control is giving Zach Wilson as good a group of receivers as possible. And you look at this group right now, it's not horrific. I mean, you got NFL caliber players in Corey Davis and Braxton Berrios, and you have a prospect with potential in Elijah Moore. It's not like there's no hope at all, but I think if you're being objective, what's the most likely scenario? That's probably not what ideally you want to give Zach Wilson. You want to give him more. So I think you have to look at drafting a receiver earlier, and part of it's due to the situation you're in. For most teams, the value is not going to be there at 4 or 10 at wide receiver. In fact, I don't even love these receivers at 10. I've done a number of Prospect Friday shows on receivers where we took a couple weeks off for free agency, but I've been doing Friday shows giving you my thoughts on prospects, and so far it's been focused on the wide receivers. And even for all of them, I've mentioned, well, maybe 10, but ideally a trade back scenario. But I just think the priority for this team has to be at the wide receiver position. And here's the other aspect of the class not being as good. It's not just when we're talking top-end talent. There's not the same level of depth that there was last year or even 2 years ago. And the Jets really need somebody who's going to be able to hit the ground running on day one. And that's already a lot to ask. Listen, I don't love to be in a position where you're demanding a rookie step in and be good right off the bat, but it's kind of the position the Jets are in. And while the odds are not that good, even picking top 10, they go down considerably once you get to round 2, round 3. It becomes quite a bit tougher to find an immediate contributor. In fact, I think people kind of don't appreciate how rare it is to have like a round 3 player at receiver or any position step in and make an immediate impact. It's very rare. You have some third round players who get playing time as rookies, but a lot of them are not contributing very well. A successful draft pick is not necessarily somebody who contributes on year 1. You're more focused on year 2, year 3, year 4. And without the same level of depth in this year's class, that puts more pressure on you to draft a receiver in the first round. So the guy I kind of look at is Garrett Wilson, because his route running, I feel like it gives him the highest odds of being a true plug-and-play type guy. But it's a tough spot. And I understand the sentiment if you're just talking about team building, because in the long run, you want the best players to be on the Jets. What's best for the Jets? You could probably argue that the thing that's best for the Jets in the long run is just to find the best player. But I think that there's something that's more important for the Jets, and that's Zach Wilson being put in a position to have success. So, and in the past, I've warned about, spending money on big names in free agency. I've talked about how, you've got to be careful. This year at the receiver position, I viewed it a little differently, because it's not just about the most efficient use of resources in a broad sense. It's also about making sure you give Zach Wilson what he needs to have success. So I understand the concern, because objectively, I think a lot of people would probably tell you this year's receiving class is not as good as it's been in recent years. But that's the situation we're in. I think the Jets really do need to add a receiver. Our next question comes from David. If Joe Douglas does not land a number 1 receiver via trade and drafts one in the first round, could you see him using another one of the Jets' picks on another receiver later to really help improve the room? I could. And it's not so much immediate help, although, if you add 2 rookie receivers, then the odds are obviously better. One of them is going to be a player on day 1. But I don't think it's not so much a move that you're making for this year. It goes back to what I said. I think you're focused more on year 2, year 3. And as much as we talk about the draft as a mechanism to fill needs, the draft is really about building strengths for the long run. It's really about finding long-term players for your franchise. It's not so much about what you're going to get immediately. And the good teams, or at least the teams that become good in this league, they're kind of proactive about their drafting. They don't wait for something to reach a crisis point before they use a pick at that position. So you look at where the Jets are right now. So let's say they draft a receiver, let's say day 2, maybe early day 3. The odds are against that guy really making much of an impact in the early stages of their career, especially in 2022. But Corey Davis is probably not a long-term player for this team. He'll be back this year. Could he be back for 2023? It's up in the air. Past 2023, are you really counting on Corey Davis to be here? I would say probably not. It's possible, but if you're asking me today, yes or no, you got to answer right now. Make a prediction. Is Corey Davis a member of the New York Jets in 2024? I'm saying probably not. So if you draft a guy this year, this gives him time to learn the system. It gives him time to develop, because typically when you're drafting a guy past the first round, and the later you get into the draft, the more true this is, they need some development. Otherwise, they'd be a higher pick. If there was nothing wrong with their game, they'd be going at the top of the first round. Typically, there are always exceptions. And there are always players drafted round 3 or round 4, round 5 who step in and contribute right away. But these players are exceptions. These are not the types of situations you can count on. I think it's the situation where you get one of those guys who contributes on day 1. You just say, wow, we really lucked out here. It's not the type of thing where you go in counting on a guy to contribute on day 1. So you draft somebody a little bit later on this year. I view them as kind of the eventual replacement for Corey Davis, and Corey Davis has shown himself to be a good locker room guy, voted captain last year. Corey Davis can kind of take this player under his wing, kind of help them work out the problems in their game, develop a little bit, and then in a year or two, this player will be ready to take over Corey Davis's role when the Jets are ready to move on from Corey Davis. So That's how I view it. It's not so much for Zach this year, especially once we get past the first round. I mean, listen, nobody'd be happier than me if the Jets were able to find an immediate contributor day 2, day 3, but it's not the kind of thing I'm counting on personally. I think it's a lot to ask. And the draft is really, it's not so, for the players the Jets draft in 2022 are really going to help the team 2023, 2024 if you do it right. I mean, even this past year where the Jets, I think, got a lot out of their rookie class, there was nobody who stepped in and was immediately at the top of the league. You saw some promise in games from Elijah Vera Tucker and Elijah Moore and Michael Carter and Michael Carter II and to a lesser extent Brandon Eccles. But none of these guys were dominating on day one. And this was, again, one of the draft classes where the Jets actually did get quite a bit of production from the rookie class. And even then, there was nobody at the top of the league. So when we're looking to the draft, we're looking in the horizon. We're not looking at the immediate. So I think that's kind of the way the Jets have to view this draft. Yes, they should be looking to draft a receiver past the first round because you want somebody to grow with Zach Wilson. But I'm not sure you're necessarily counting on that guy to contribute immediately. Well, you are full of questions about the way the offense is going to work. Ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk a little bit more about wide receiver, and we'll also go on to other offensive positions as we continue on this Wednesday mailbag show. We just talked about whether the Jets should look to draft a receiver in the upcoming NFL draft. That's where teams select new football players. I got to tell you, though, if there was ever a draft for protein bars, there's no doubt Built Bar would be picked number 1 overall. Built Bar is a protein bar, but it doesn't taste like one. It's the best tasting protein bar on the market because it's covered in 100% real chocolate, and there are so many delicious flavors. You've got mint brownie, you've got coconut almond, and new for this month is white chocolate cookies and cream. These bars are all delicious, and new flavors are coming out all the time. If they think a flavor might be good, they'll make it. It will be delicious, and it will be good for you. Because at Built Bar, they're all about the taste. They make it delicious first, and then figure out how to make it healthy. And somehow they do it, because most Built Bars only contain 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. Just compare that to a candy bar, which usually has around 240 calories, 30 grams of sugar, and dozens of net carbs. You want to check out Built Bars? Go to Built.com, and while you're at it, order some and use promo code LOCK15. That promo code will get you 15% off your order. Again, it's promo code LOCK15. It's one word, no space, LOCKED, number 1, number 5, for 15% off at Built, BUILT.com. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen every day, and make sure you're following Locked On NFL. Locked On experts covering the biggest stories around the NFL every Monday through Friday in less than 30 minutes. It's free and available wherever you get your podcasts, as is Locked On Jets, and we continue our Wednesday mailbag show. Our next question, John, I think the entire fan base wants a playmaker, specifically at receiver. However, in the LaFleur-Shanahan offenses, they've always worked without a true number 1 receiver. We have Corey Davis and Elijah Moore, who are very capable receivers. We've added 2 reliable tight ends, and we have a good pass-catching running back. With the draft left, do you think fans are overreacting to Joe Douglas not landing a household name at wide receiver? Well, I don't know that I would agree that the LaFleur-Shanahan offense has never had a number 1 receiver. I mean, San Francisco, they've got Deebo Samuel. I mean, he's pretty good. And beyond that, in San Francisco, you've got George Kittle, who kind of replicate, if you have like a top tight end like a George Kittle, then he kind of takes the role of the number 1 receiver. And even then, you still have Deebo Samuel. You look at Green Bay, Matt LaFleur. They've had Devontae Adams. I mean, that's as number 1 of a number 1 receiver as you can get. If you go back to Kyle Shanahan in his last job before he took over San Francisco, he was the offensive coordinator in Atlanta, and they had Julio Jones. So, listen, does it have to be a receiver? I mean, I guess if you got like a Kittle-type tight end, then maybe you don't need one, or if you got like even like a guy who's like a Jonathan Taylor-type running back. But those guys are not that common, and I don't know if you count on getting one of them. The easiest position to get the big-time playmaker at is receiver. So it's not that the Jets have bad players, and I feel like we've watched so much bad football through the years that just like having functional NFL players, that feels good enough, but it's really not. I mean, yes, Corey Davis is a quality NFL player. Elijah Moore is a guy with a lot of potential. Elijah Moore could turn into that number 1 receiver, but I don't know if I want to put that pressure on him. I don't know if I want everything riding on Elijah Moore has to turn into a number 1 receiver or we lack a premium playmaker. So, listen, if they find like that type of tight end or that type of running back, then yeah, okay, I guess you can do that in place of the top receiver, but you got to find some sort of big time playmaker. And most likely, I would say, it's probably going to be at the receiver position. Our next question, would right tackle really be a setback for Mekhi Becton? Is it not possible for a player to be a better fit as a road grading right tackle, run blocking specialist, and not as good as an athletic pass blocking left tackle? Would this player still be considered a bust? If Becton turns out to be a great right tackle, is that not a major win for the franchise? Oh, it's absolutely a major win for the franchise. Listen, right tackle is an important position, and its importance has risen through the years. We got to a point in the NFL where left tackle was viewed as the premium position, and that's where your best offensive lineman typically went. Well, defensive coordinators are pretty smart in the NFL, and they realize, you know what, if I got a premium pass rusher, and the other team's best offensive lineman is going to be the left tackle, well, I'm going to put the premium pass rusher against the right tackle, because that's an easier matchup for him. And in recent years, I think you've kind of seen the NFL start to adjust, and you're starting to see the right tackle position rise in prominence. So more important players are there, and there are many situations where the right tackle actually faces tougher pass rushers than the left tackle does as a result. And even Joe Douglas in his history, if you look in Philadelphia, he gave out a pretty big contract to a right tackle. So I don't think it's the end of the world if Becton ends up at right tackle. I still do think left tackle matters a little bit more, because most quarterbacks are right-handed, and all the Jets quarterbacks are right-handed. So that means when your quarterback's dropping back to pass as a righty, even if your right tackle gets beat, he's still probably going to be able to see the pass rusher in his line of sight and either like step up or evade the pressure, or even if he's going to get hit, he'll be able to brace himself. Whereas the left tackle is, of course, the blind side where the quarterback can't see, so you really need a guy who's rock solid at the left tackle position. So I don't think it's the end of the world if Becton moves to right tackle. See, I'm conflicted on this, because part of me is really happy the Jets aren't doing this by draft position, because 9 times out of 10 in the NFL, Becton went in the top 15 2 years ago, so he'd just be handed the left tackle job no matter what the performance was. So I kind of like that the Jets are doing it based on merit. On the other hand, I do wonder a little bit, and I do think it's possible Becton's final home is at the right tackle position, but part of me feels like because left tackle is the most important, even though I think Becton may end up at right tackle, you'd like to see him kind of fail his way out of there, or you'd like there to be a good reason. Is George Fant's play... George Fant's play was good. Is it a good enough reason to change your plans about your trajectory for this play? And I know these are contradictory, and that's kind of why I'm up in the air on this, but to answer the question, Mekhi Becton working out as a right tackle, that's a tremendous success for the Jets if it happens. If he turns out to be that good, then I think you've got no problems. You have absolutely no problems there. Our next question, do you see the Jets trying to add another player who could play the Kyle Juszczyk role for LaFleur's offense? There are still some options out there like Anthony Firkser or Elijah Penny, who would be an upgrade over Nick Bowden and Trevon Wesco. I was disappointed the Jets did not try to sign one of those guys. There were a couple out there. I think Firkser could be a great fit for that role, and he's young and cheap. I feel like if the Jets want that role, it's going to be Tyler Conklin. I spent the show yesterday talking about some of the things Robert Saleh said at the NFL owners meetings. I did not get to this, but one of the things he mentioned was that they kind of view CJ Uzama and Tyler Conklin as different players playing out different roles. Uzama's more just the traditional tight end. And the way Saleh made it sound was that Conklin's going to be more of a move guy. He's going to be a guy who you'll see in multiple spots. Now, we always talk about the Shanahan offense, but Mike LaFleur, I'm sure, has his own ideas of what he wants out of an offense, and he's not going to do things exactly the same as Kyle Shanahan. And yes, in San Francisco, you see a lot of the two-back offense, whereas with the Jets this past year, maybe it was due to the lack of a fullback, but you did not really see the Jets focus on having a fullback as much. They were more of like a two tight end type offense when they went big. So it might just be that Mike LaFleur doesn't want a player like this in his role. He'd rather just have the two tight end look. Or it could be that Tyler Conklin's going to play that role. It'll be interesting to see this play out. I don't have a great answer for that, but I think if it is anybody, it's going to be Conklin. Maybe they'll surprise me, but that's my hunch is that it's like kind of a two tight end situation they're looking at. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll close things out. We'll talk even more about wide receiver, and we'll talk about a few other aspects of the Jets offense. That's ahead on this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. Of course, it is the NFL offseason. The Jets are looking to fix their roster, especially the skill players around Zach Wilson. And you should know that this episode is brought to you by Rock Auto. And if you need to fix your car or truck the way the Jets need to fix their offense, go to rockauto.com, because with the ever-increasing number of makes and models, it's just impossible now for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. So why endure pointless or intimidating questioning while that person behind the counter orders the parts on their computer and their warehouse only carries one of those brands? You could do this yourself. You've got computers with access to rockauto.com at home and in your pocket. And you should know that Rock Auto is a family business. They've been serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years. Their prices are reliably low for every customer. Their website's easy to use. They have the solution for your auto parts needs. So save time and money when using Rock Auto. Just go there right now. rockauto.com. See all the parts available for your car or truck. And while you're at it, tell them Locked On sent you in their How Did You Hear About Us box. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Mailbag Wednesday. Our next question: do you think that it's just as urgent for the Jets to add a tight end as it is for them to add a wide receiver? Mike LaFleur is going to want to play a lot of 12 personnel, which is one running back, two tight ends, two receivers, and you're one injury away from Ryan Griffin, again, having a premium role. I think this is a good year for the Jets to draft a tight end in general, because now you've got CJ Uzama, you've got Tyler Conklin, and tight end is a notoriously difficult position to transition from college to the NFL because there's so much you got to learn the blocking, you got to learn the routes. I mean, it's kind of like part offensive lineman, part receiver. You've got to learn the routes at the slot, the outside, and your regular tight end route. There's just a lot to learn. So having these guys kind of buys the Jets the benefit of time, I think, and it gives whoever they draft time to develop. So I from that standpoint, and CJ Uzama's pushing 30, so he's not going to be around here that long. So you give this guy a year or two to develop, the guy you draft, and then he can step into the lineup. He'll be developed. He'll be ready to go. Kind of what I talked about earlier at the wide receiver position. It's not as urgent as wide receiver, though. Listen, probably nobody has been more critical of Ryan Griffin through the years than I have. But even I'm looking at this and saying, you know what, if Ryan Griffin's your number 2 tight end, it's not great, but it's not like it's going to destroy the offense. I mean, Tyler Conklin, if you look at his profile, is kind of like a good version of Ryan Griffin. So Ryan Griffin, I think, actually kind of fits as like a backup for Tyler Conklin. So I don't think it's the end of the world. It's not ideal, but like at some point you have to prioritize, and I do think receiver is a bigger priority for the Jets than tight end is, and I think it's a much bigger priority. Our next question. Hi, John. You've talked extensively about how the Jets should have added a veteran number 1 receiver during this offseason. At this point, it seems like the ship may have sailed. Assuming that this is indeed the case, do you think it would be worth it for the Jets to pursue any of the remaining veteran free agents who are still available? I love Braxton Berrios as much as the next guy, but I think heading into the season with the idea of him being the number 3 receiver is laughable, not to mention having Jeff Smith as the number 4. Receivers like Jarvis Landry and Will Fuller may not be bona fide number 1 receivers anymore if they ever were, but surely they would add a lot to the room, a room that is woefully short on talent. Or do you think they'd be too expensive for what they bring to the table? Well, I think you've hit on like the other issue at receiver, because I've focused more on like the lack of a top end receiver, but it's a good point. There's also a dangerous lack of depth at the receiver position. And the way things stand right now, the Jets cannot afford to suffer an injury at receiver. You suffer an injury at receiver, you're right back to you're kind of like where you were at the end of the year, where Zach Wilson did not have real much of a fighting chance. I mean, you're one injury away from Jeff Smith stepping into the starting lineup, and that's a big problem too. So, yeah, I would like to see the Jets bring in somebody like that. I mean, I don't know if Landry's the right guy, but Will Fuller, I mean, the issue with Will Fuller is he can't stay on the field. But the way I almost view it is like, let's say you can get him on an incentive-laden deal based on his ability to stay healthy. Or let's say you only get him for 8 games. 8 games of him is probably better than 0 games of him. So as long as listen, if we're talking a big money deal with lots of guarantees, then you can't do it for a guy who can't stay on the field. But he brings a certain element. He brings speed to the table. There are things Will Fuller provides, and more than that, I mean, as much as you need like that premium target, you also really need depth, because there is 0 depth at the receiver position right now for the New York Jets. And that's another reason why I feel like there's a pretty good chance the Jets are going to draft somebody early. There's just you're absolutely right about that. You've got to add better depth, because being one injury away from Jeff Smith starting for you, that's just not a good situation to be in. And I think something is going to have to be addressed there. I don't think there's any question about that. Well, that's all for our show today. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. As always, if you enjoyed the show, subscribe to it. You'll never miss an episode if you do so. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. It helps us out tremendously, as does giving this show a thumbs up if you're watching on YouTube. Have a great Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.